Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. And my name is Lindsay Powell. I'm the Assistant District Fish Biologist for the Mid-Columbia District. We're located in Dallas, but our district incorporates the Hood River Watershed. And tonight I'll be talking about Hood River bull trout. So to kick us off, I just have a photo of a bull trout captured at the East Fork weir in G last year.
If you want, I can put it for you.
Go next slide. There's a couple animation too. Yeah, there we go.
Little arrows and one.
So just some context and species history and information. Bull trout, the scientific name is Salvelinus confluentis. They are classified under the Endangered Species Act as threatened, and they've been listed since 1999. The part of their listing was after a precipitous decline in their population abundance across North America, and particularly the United States. They're a member of the char family, which is the genus Salvelinus. One common maybe misnomer is that bull trout are commonly referenced as Dolly Varden. Though they are in fact two separate species, Dolly Varden being the species mama. But as far as bull trout go, the requirements for bull trout is that they have some of the most specific habitat requirements of any salmon in North America. They're very sensitive to changes in habitat, and they're really dependent upon what we generally reference as the 4 C's, which is clean, cool, connected, and complex habitat. On the subject of cool and clean, that's obviously referencing water temperature. Generally, the temperature requirements for bull trout is between 12 and 15 degrees Celsius, which is generally mid-50 to high 40 degree Fahrenheit. Additionally, juveniles have even stricter temperature requirements, and they often require water temperatures between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius, which is high 40s to low 50s degree Fahrenheit. And then as far as the life history of bull trout, and life history meaning different migratory patterns that different populations demonstrate. Bull trout can have resident, fluvial, adfluvial, or sea run life histories. Just briefly to describe those, the resident, or what we would call stream resident bull trout population exists in small upper watershed streams, and they exist only in those small tributary streams. Generally are smaller populations that are also smaller in size. The fluvial bull trout, that life history is that those fish are reliant upon a larger river system and also small tributary streams. They spend the majority of their life in a large river system like the Hood River or the Columbia River, and then migrate into smaller headwater streams for spawning. The adfluvial life history, adfluvial is an animal that occupies a lake or reservoir environment, but then exits that environment and also occupies tributary streams. And so the adfluvial life history for bull trout is that they're occupying a reservoir or lake for the majority of their life, but they're out migrating from that reservoir, entering tributary streams to spawn. And then the last and most uncommon and probably the least documented life history form of bull trout is that there are sea run bull trout, meaning that they go to the ocean, similar to salmon and steelhead. So yeah, anatomy is a component of their life history, but it's not very common. Next slide. So talking about, I mentioned they're a member of the char family. And so within that family, there are several other species that we have that are not necessarily native to the Western United States, but are been placed here. And those are primarily brook trout and lake trout. Brook trout pictured on the upper left, and lake trout on the upper right. Brook trout and lake trout are also members of the char family, and they pose several concerns as far as bull trout populations. The first threat for species overlap between brook trout and lake trout is the concern for hybridization, which is that these two species can breed with bull trout and then produce hybrid offspring. That's a big concern as far as population levels concerned. Firstly, because it's thought that some but not all hybrid offspring are sterile, and secondly, it's essentially compromises the genetics of any local bull trout population. Additionally, some other concerns about species overlap between lake trout and brook trout within bull trout populations is the potential for misidentification among anglers, especially when there's a harvest component to any fishery. And so there's a lot of mantras out there, but one of them that I like is just that if you don't know, let it go, which is to say that if you're fishing in waters and are catching fish, and you're not totally sure what it is that you're catching, it's best just to let it go. Just with the notion in mind that it could be something that that you wouldn't want to harvest. So talking about the range of bull trout and their historical distribution and their precipitous decline, this is an image borrowed from a paper out of University of British Columbia. And this shows the historical distribution of bull trout in North America. You can see that historically their range was as far south as northern California and Nevada, and up as far north as the southern, northwestern, and Yukon territories. But throughout, I guess throughout the history of this species, there's been a 60% decline in their abundance in their range in North America. And then this red symbol on that map there just sort of points you to where we are and where we'll be looking at, which of course is in the distribution of bull trout. And so then zooming into the Hood River Watershed, where we live and work in a watershed where we're fortunate enough to have bull trout present. I mentioned that bull trout are an ESA listed species. And so part of being an ESA listed species, there's an associated recovery plan published for ESA listed species. And within that recovery plan, recovery units are identified. So the Hood River bull trout population is classified within what we call the coastal recovery unit. And then within those recovery units, there are core areas defined. And this gets at the Hood River core area, which encompasses all of the bull trout within the Hood River watershed. So looking at the distribution of bull trout within our watershed, this image obviously illustrates the Hood River main stem to the Columbia, and then West Fork, Middle Fork, East Fork. The pink line indicates the typical distribution of bull trout within the watershed. So generally, bull trout occupy the main stem Hood River, and then up into the Middle Fork and Upper Middle Fork drainage. That being said, there is dispersal throughout the watershed, and bull trout have been observed in the West Fork and the East Fork. But it's just thought that the majority of their occupancy is up in the Middle Fork drainage and down to the main stem. So while it is references the Hood River core area, the population is fragmented, meaning that we sort of have two local populations within our watershed. And obviously that the green portrays the other component of the Hood River bull trout population, which is the population that exists above Laurance Lake Dam, or pardon me, Clear Branch Dam. And for those who don't know, Clear Branch Dam is an impoundment that forms Laurance Lake. And there's no fish passage facilities that exist at Clear Branch Dam. There is annual spill off the surface spillway, which allows for some downstream passage of fish, but there's no way for those fish to get back up. But then what's important to consider when we're looking at this fragmented population is that the green lines, those two green lines, which are the tributaries to Laurance Lake, represent the majority, if not really the only productive bull trout reproduction in the watershed. So the majority of reproduction, and certainly the consistent reproduction, is happening above Laurance Lake. And then the downstream population represented by the pink line is pretty much just being supplemented by that Laurance Lake population. So anyways, that's good for that slide. So then just to touch on what's been done as far as bull trout work in the watershed in recent history. In 2006 through 2009, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's Native Fish Investigations Research Group conducted a multi-year study, and they focused on, like we were just talking about, sort of those two local populations, one being the population that exists in the main stem Hood River and up the Middle Fork, and the second population being the fish that are occupying the habitat above Clear Branch Dam. And so they looked at a number of things like, limiting factors, biological requirements, species distribution, and also population abundance of both juveniles and adults. But just to briefly summarize what they found in the late 2000s, they estimated the Clear Branch population to be between 101 and 115 adults, and the Hood River population to be less than 28 adults. And so then past that research program, which was again in the late 2000s, other bull trout monitoring within the basin has been limited to incidental catch of bull trout at juvenile and adult salmon and steelhead traps. So while bull trout aren't necessarily targeted in those trapping, they are incidentally caught, and through that we're able to document some migration and use of bull trout within the watershed. And then the bulk of what's happened in recent years as far as bull trout monitoring is that Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Forest Service annually conduct red surveys above Clear Branch Dam, so for those tributary streams to Laurance Lake. And that goes on, it's gone on since 2006 through present day, and those surveys occur during the fall, which is the spawning time for bull trout. Next slide, please. So now I mentioned the spawning ground surveys above Clear Branch Dam. And so this is sort of zooming in on those spawning ground surveys that are conducted annually, and the green highlighted lines illustrate where spawning ground surveys take place annually. So you can see on Clear Branch leading into Laurance Lake, on Pinnacle Creek, and then there are annual spawning ground surveys that occur on what we call Lower Clear Branch at the base of Clear Branch Dam. Slide. And so then just to give some context about red surveys and even what a red is that so reds are substrate piles that fish dig during spawning, and females lay their eggs in the red, which is sort of pillow of gravel, and then those eggs are then spawned by male fish. They're pretty distinct when you see them in the stream, and they're really easily defined by a large what we call pillow of gravel in a deep pit in the front. And they're generally made in tailouts of pools. And so it's like a lot of things, it's really hard to get a good picture of them, but that yellow circle is showing you where the red is, and you can see that smaller substrate sort of clustered together right here. That's a little bit brighter than the other substrate in the stream, and also just sort of in that sort of pillow formation. There's also somebody who may or may not be in this room. Make sure there as well. So anyway, so that's when we're doing spawning ground surveys, that's what we're looking for, and what spawning ground surveys entail is just walking the stream, whether it be once or multiple times a week, and documenting the number of those reds that we're observing. And so this presents our red survey data dating back to 2006 and through 2022. The blue bars represent reds observed on Upper Clear Branch. The red represents Pinnacle Creek, and the yellow green represents Lower Clear Branch. So first of all, you can see that, like I said, really the majority of spawning is occurring above Clear Branch Dam. Very few reds observed below on Lower Clear Branch Creek, even though there are spawning ground surveys that occur there annually. And then the other thing is that you see some years of really low red counts, which is concerning as far as the viability of the population, just in that this represents the majority of natural reproduction of bull trout in the basin. So some years red counts are more abundant, but some years quite low. So talking about what's been done in the past and then ongoing monitoring. In 2021, Jason Seals, who's in the room, and our native fish investigations program decided to start a new project, which was a video monitoring project. Our native fish group has been using video weir technology to evaluate other bull trout populations in the state. So we collaborated with them to deploy systems of our own. The main motivations for starting this new project was that we wanted to have updated population estimates that we could compare to the previous research done in the late 2000s. We wanted an ability to provide an updated calibration for our red surveys. And we also wanted to be able to document the timing of reservoir use. So that's to say we want to see when fish are leaving the reservoir, so they're moving upstream into tributaries, and we also want to see when fish are entering the reservoir. And this was a project funded by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and conducted in cooperation and help from the U.S. Forest Service. And then that photo to the right just shows you, obviously in the office, but just sort of the technology that we're using. The little circle sky is our camera, and there's a DVR and monitor. So this part's underwater, and this is housed on site. So then back to our upper Middle Fork drainage and looking at the area above Laurance Lake and tributaries to Laurance Lake. These two yellow symbols just illustrate where we deployed video weir stations. So we ultimately had two of them out, one low down on Clear Branch and one relatively low in the system on Pinnacle. So these are our systems. I know they don't look like much, but this is the Pinnacle Creek video weir site, and on the right is the Clear Branch video weir site. So the Clear Branch site was installed in approximately June through October in 2021 and 2022. I say approximately June because we didn't get the system out in 2022 until early July. However, we did not deploy the Pinnacle Creek system in 2021, and that was an addition in 2022. And that system was installed late July and ran through October. So you can kind of, I mean, they look pretty primitive, but we have these fixed panels which are directing fish through the center of the wooded channel here, and in that we have the video housed in a passage chute, and you'll see some photos, but those are our sites. So with video review, the camera is motion activated, which helps in that we're not sorting through just, you know, days and days worth of footage, but the camera is also really sensitive. So we're dealing with a really high volume of video footage that we need to sort through in order to find out how many bull trout we have and also see what they're doing. So the first thing we have to do is sort through raw footage, which is a fairly big job. And to be honest, the majority of what we see is actually not bull trout. So we see a lot of other salmonids that occupy Laurance Lake and tributaries, but we also see a variety of other, you know, non-fish animals. And if you go next slides, and then press play, and kind of hold over. I think if you go up, yeah. So this is just to give you a taste of what non-fish footage looks like. And so if you just go right here. So there's a beaver, of course. And they're pretty regular. And yeah, they're not going to be stopped by the video shoot.
No, they can go over.
Right. Oh yeah, no, they're regulars for sure. You see them a lot in video footage. So then you can go next slide. I think they got hidden. There you go. Thank you. So once we have raw video footage sorted out, and now we're just looking at our bull trout only footage. The first thing that we generally do is identify adults versus juvenile bull trout. You can see what the fish look like. This is the 2021 video system, so the 2022 images look a little bit different. And then you can go next slide. So how we identify adults versus juveniles is primarily on length. What we have built into the passage chute is actually a measuring board. So each of these notches represents 50 millimeters. And so by this measuring board, we're able to get at an approximate length of fish. And this is helpful to both identify individuals or identify adults from juveniles, but also to identify individual fish. But so just to give you an idea, you know, looking at those red lines, the three of them each represent 100 millimeters, then this is about half 50 and 25. So that's approximately 325 millimeter fish. As far as what we call an adult versus a juvenile, it's partially based on passage direction. So whether that fish is leaving the reservoir, entering the reservoir, but it's the best metric is length. So we call adult fish over 205 millimeters, so approximately 8 inches, and we identify juveniles as less than 8 inches. And so once that step's complete, the final step as far as our video footage review is to enumerate passage. So what that really means is that we're looking at the passage direction and timing of fish moving upstream. So in the case of the video, we're oriented fish moving left to right are moving upstream. So they're leaving Laurance Lake and they're moving up into a tributary, and fish coming downstream are moving from right to left. But through this passage direction, We're able to both identify individuals, so that's how we're able to get out our population estimates. And we're also able to document reservoir use and timing of fish entering and exiting the reservoir, which are several of the things we were interested in. Next slide. So to go over our results for 2021 and 2022. So as far as adult fish, in 2021, we estimated 126 individuals passing upstream. So those are fish leaving Laurance Lake and passing upstream to spawn. What this equates to is about 3.9 fish per red. And so how we get to that is the number of reds we observed in 2021, and the number of adult fish that we counted. And these numbers are really similar to what we the native fish program found in their late 2000s work. 2022, we had the Clear Branch video system in again, yet in 2022, we only counted 40 individuals passing upstream. So a big drop as far as the abundance of spawners between these 2 years. However, our portion of fish per red really didn't change. I mean, it changed obviously one fish per red, but proportionally it really wasn't as different. And that's also because we saw far less reds in 2021 than we did in 2022. Pinnacle Creek, not totally surprisingly, just based upon the number of reds we have seen there historically, we saw 6 individual fish passing up the Pinnacle Creek site, which amounts to 3 fish per red, which again is relatively consistent. So those are our general results as far as the abundance of adults. And then next slide.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So on the 2021 results, where there were so many more fish moving up into Pinnacle and into Clear Branch and Pinnacle, presumably. So you've got, let's say, 4 fish per red, a spawning pair. So there's potentially double the number of spawning pairs, assuming there's an equal split of males to females. And in 2022, there's fewer fish moving upstream, but so fewer fish for reds. It's kind of suggests more competition. And I'm wondering whether you guys, if those numbers are different enough to suggest that, if you've got 126 individuals moving upstream in a given year, are they limited by spawning habitat, right? Like you're not getting as many reds, for the fish that are going upstream compared to a year where there's fewer fish going upstream and relatively more of them are affiliated with the red. So
yeah, I think it's hard. It's hard to really know with any degree of certainty, and it's also, I think probably the assumption that the ratio of males to females is probably not 1-to-1. We probably have more males than we do females, but and also just with it being only a 2-year data set, I guess it's hard to really say for certain, but I mean, it's not a huge difference, I guess. At least it doesn't seem to be. And so just briefly to touch on what we saw with juvenile fish and see this little guy, that's kind of what they look like. We saw in 2021, we saw 87 juveniles move downstream. In 2022, 61. So again, less fish, but the juvenile data comes with a lot of caveats, in that we're really not documenting their period of out-migration or movement into the reservoir, because that's likely in the spring. It's also really hard to tell them apart from one another, which, yeah, it's like they all kind of look like that. But anyways, that's just what we saw. And then we didn't see any juveniles moving downstream in Pinnacle Creek, which again, it's not super surprising. It's not to say they're not there. We're just really not documenting their movement with this system. So just quickly to look at what we saw, and I touched on length and our ability to get out length. And so 2022 is in the red and 2021 is in the white, but this is the length frequency of adult bull trout. And so The white obviously represents 2021, and you can see just how many more fish we did see in 2021. But the distribution is really similar, and the majority of fish are around that 300mm size class. And then we still have a few large fish that we have seen the last several years that are in the system. And so just to show, and this is again a video, this is, like I said, the 300mm size class is sort of the prototype for what we see moving out of Laurance Lake, and that's a 300mm fish swimming. And again, this is moving upstream, so out of the reservoir up into Hood Branch.
How fast is the water flowing?
I think the velocity, it's like maybe 18 cubic feet per second. But it's not like it's not I guess it's not pressurized to go through the passage chute. It's all the same, relatively the same velocity, because the panels allow flow through them. But yeah, the fish would like to sort of linger in the box. And if you go to the next slide. Oh, again, next spring. So this is, I mentioned, those larger fish that we see. And this is a large bull trout coming out of Laurance and up in the Branch. So definitely neat to see those big fish.
And how big was that one about?
Over 500 meters, so over 20 inches. Then we go next slide. Next again. So I talked about passage timing and what we're looking for as far as bull trout movement into and out of the reservoir. This figure summarizes the passage timing of fish moving upstream, adult fish moving upstream out of Laurance Lake and into Clear Branch. In 2021, which is the white, 2022, which is the red. So, and then additionally, what's represented on the left vertical axis is the reservoir level. And this data was collected by the Forest Service. This shows the reservoir height over time, the period being June through October in 2022, and the reservoir level in 2021. So you can see, obviously, the reservoir was much lower in 2021 as compared to 2022, but our observations of fish passage upstream are relatively similar. With the bulk of upstream passage being late August through early September, which coincides with their spawn timing. Then we go next slide. And so just to look at what juvenile passage looked like, again, 2022 and 2021. And in 2021, you can see we had this big pulse of juveniles that moved downstream in mid-July through early August. And in 2022, the juvenile downstream passage was a lot more uniform. But again, this is definitely an underrepresentation of what juvenile passage really looks like in the system, since our videos are not installed when they're generally moving downstream. So next slide. And then just really briefly, so there's that reservoir height, idea of reservoir height, but with that goes the temperature of the reservoir. This is the 2021 data collected by the Forest Service. I mentioned that bull trout have really specific temperature requirements as far as their species go. Generally, 15 being an optimal temperature, and 15 is represented by that horizontal dotted line. And this is just to show that that there are periods of time in midsummer when the Laurance Lake Reservoir is certainly above what optimal conditions are as far as temperature for adult bull trout, but particularly for juvenile trout. Yeah, so anyways, and yeah, like I said, this is 2021, but that's just to illustrate that they're dependent upon the reservoir, but the reservoir isn't always very hospitable for them. The next slide. So just to look back on our work and then going forward, overall, the abundance of bull trout in Hood River continues to be very low, but the Clear Branch population is seems to be similar to what was documented in the mid-2000s. And again, we are only looking at the population above Clear Branch Dam, not the population below. But additionally, looking at reservoir use and reservoir conditions, that they are variable, but they're generally unfavorable for bull trout during the summer. It's just worth noting that these fish are dependent upon the reservoir and have adapted to this adfluvial life history, which is that they're occupying the reservoir. But the reservoir, because of the lack of passage, also poses population challenges for the fish that occupy the habitat downstream. Now, those downstream fish are isolated from being able to access really the bulk of the spawning habitat within the basin. But all in all, there's certainly a need for continued monitoring, and that's our plan. Next slide. And as far as future monitoring, we're planning on installing the video weirs through 2026. So that will give us a 6-year data set, which will be nice to have as far as being able to have a longer term set of data to compare. We'll continue red surveys, and also we'll be doing temperature and flow monitoring in Laurance Lake tributaries, and the Forest Service will continue Laurance Lake physical monitoring. Next slide. So this is Bob, who's here, and Sarah, or maybe it's Maddie, but anyways, they're working on the Pinnacle site. And this is just to say thanks to Steve with Native Fish, our staff in the Dallas, and Forest Service staff. So,
Thank you. Hey, anybody with questions in the room?
Since you mentioned the low population, what is the population number where you start getting concerned about genetic diversity and how close are we to that?
Those things are parameters that are mostly defined in the recovery plan, but I think generally it's less than 100 adults. And Jason might be able to confirm that, but so we're not far from it, honestly. It is certainly a very small population. Like you said, things like genetic diversity, especially when fish are geographically isolated in an area without the ability to migrate throughout the system.
Speaking of the geographic isolation, has the population above the dam at Laurance Lake, has there been an observed divergence in the genetics of the physical behaviors and characteristics in that population?
I can't speak to the genetics because we haven't done that work. As far as the behaviors, no, apart from they just had to adapt to become adfluvial fish. And prior to the dam, all the Hood River bull trout had that fluvial life form, meaning they, traveled up and down the Hood River Basin out to the Columbia freely, and now as far as their adaptations, that those fish that are above Clear Branch Dam are isolated there, with the exception of spell. But
why haven't the fish migrated up the west fork? Seems that would be a very clear for tributary in order to spawn.
I guess I don't know. The West Fork is certainly glacially influenced. Not to say the Middle Fork's not, but I don't know of any specific tributaries in the West Fork that would be particularly conducive to bull trout. Jason, you?
Well, basically, bull trout, like the threshold between like occupation and occupation is very fine, and we found that in river basins across the region. And so there's a lot of places, not just say the West Fork, but other places in the state where you would think bull trout would occupy, but the threshold for temperature of juvenile rearing and spawning and incubation is, so it's very cold, like generally lower than say 48 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, the habitat specifications are so fine that even though there may be places in the West Fork where it's cold, it might be in the low 50s, for instance, but it's just not quite to, what they require.
So the population in the Hood River itself is sustaining itself by spawning somewhere.
Well, the thinking and a part of that native fish research is that actually the Hood River population is supplemented by the Laurance Lake population, meaning that the bulk and really the only consistent natural reproduction within the watershed is above Clear Branch Dam, and juveniles or subadults or adults from above Clear Branch Dam are spilling over the dam intermittently, if there is spill at the spillway. And that's really what's sustaining the Hood River population below Clear Branch Dam, at least, and that's what native fish found when they did screw trapping near the base and then tracked the movement of those fish.
Do you have numbers on how many actually spill over the dam?
No, I don't. But obviously, I mean, that native fish work suggested no less than 30 fish generally in the population, so.
But we had Powerdale Dam in place for a long time, and, we did catch a lot of bull trout, and it was probably 15 to 17 years where we were actively trapping, and so some of the years we did have a lot of bull trout that were passing through Powerdale, especially around the 2000-2001 time frame, which we always thought coincided after the 96 flood, where there was a lot of spill. We saw a lot of bull trout in Powerdale, so we do have some information on the fish that have probably spilled out and then come back out of Columbia. They do appear to be overwintering. A lot of them overwintering in Columbia. The ones that do spill out. And there was also a population below the dam that was, had successful spawning and reproduction, which was in Compass Creek, which is a tributary to Coe Creek. But there's been a couple of, I don't know what the years maybe Craig knows, but a couple of years where there were outbursts out of Coe and it actually jumped over into Compass. And then, so we haven't had any documented successful reproduction there since the late 90s.
Are there any other areas in the state that have high populations of bull trout?
The highest population of bull trout is in the Toyas River, which is a tributary to Lake Billy Chinook. And bull trout are actually so abundant in the Toyas that there's allowable harvest of bull trout in Lake Billy Chinook for fish of a certain size class and during certain times of the year. But that's certainly the most abundant population in the state.
How many eggs get laid and fertilized in a red? And what are the main factors that thin those numbers down to 3 fish per red?
The main factors that influence survival, or I just missed the end of your question.
I imagine there's a lot of eggs that get laid in a red. What are the main things that thin the numbers down from all those numerous eggs down to 3 surviving fish that pass through the passage?
So I guess two parts to answer your question. The first is that I don't really know honestly what the fecundity of bull trout is. I would guess maybe 1,000 eggs, several hundred to 1,000 eggs in a red. And as far as the survivability of those reds, that's really dependent upon environmental conditions. So one of them is being substrate, the second being oxygen levels in the water, and the third being temperature levels, and additionally flow. And like I said, the habitat and temperature requirements for juvenile bull trout are really strict, and that they really need cold water to survive. And as far as even in their incubation, they need water that's 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. And as far as what you mentioned about maybe 2 or 3 fish, per red. Is that sort of what you were getting at? So what that 2 to 3 fish or 3 to 4 fish per red means is not so much juveniles, but it's the number of adults that we're seeing in proportion to the number of reds that we see on an annual basis. So it's not really to say that only 3 fish are surviving from a red. It's actually looking at the other end of their life cycle, which is when they're spawning and how many fish we're estimating based on how many reds we're seeing. If that makes sense. And obviously, like all salmonids, their survival from eggs to adults is really low. But yeah, the 3 fish per red is not 3 juveniles, but 3 adults per red.
It seems like the assumption is that all or the vast majority of like the population above Cedar Branch Dam are adfluvial. Is that true, or do we know of just resident fish like staying in the channel above Laurance Lake?
The assumption is that they're fluvial, and I think that is the case.
Like
Is that
adfluvial.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the assumption is that they are at fluvial. There's
Okay.
not any stream resident fish, bull trout that live in tributaries to Laurance Lake. There are cutthroats, so there's other salmonids, but as far as bull trout, their life history above Laurance Lake is exclusively that fluvial component.
We weren't really sure, like before 2006, and that was part of the native fish research, was to determine whether there were residents or fluvial, whatever you want to call them. So we did large scale shocking, like the entire watershed, to look for residents and found them.
But like the Metolius, are there residents, or do they also just go to Lake Village and up and back?
They're primarily at fluvial as well. Like that population is identified as at fluvial, and I think it's the same that they don't see stream residents and it's also like comparing the different types of fish that come from these different populations, and like Metolius bull trout are huge, which really represents that they're part of that affluvial life history because they're foraging in the reservoir, which is like ocean.
Yeah, that seems strange to me. I don't know very much about them all, but like the Metolius seems like it would stay very cold, whereas Lake Village seems like it did very warm.
Right, and that is true. I guess that, and obviously not being an expert on Village Chinook by any means, but that bull trout primarily occupy the Metolius arm of Lake Village Chinook. So they're spending their time in the coldest water that's available to them in that reservoir. And I don't know what those temperature profiles are, but I know that the bulk of the fishery occurs in the Metolius arm, and that's where people catch bull trout. I don't think Village Chinook is in the Metolius arm.
Reservoirs stratify, those reservoirs are pretty deep, so there's all this cold water near the bottom. They might hang out there. There's kokanee, Village Chinook, which is a great food source. for them.
In Village Chinook, are you seeing the fish populations move downstream below the dam as well? Because they have a surface collector, don't they?
They do. Well, so I guess, first of all, that's technically out of our district, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but as far as passage at Lake Village Chinook, so that's the Pelham project, which is 3 dams. The only passage of bull trout from Lake Village Chinook are subadults of a certain size class that they're collecting at their fish transfer facility, which is that selective water withdrawal system they have. And so they're capturing bull trout of all size classes, I mean adult fish, but the large adult they're returning to the reservoir, but fish of a certain size class, they are passing downstream of the project, which is, a 45-minute drive down to below the reroute dam. But there's no trip back up for bull trout on the Deschutes above.
But there's bull trout below as well. There's a couple of small populations below the project.
Are there any questions from folks online on Zoom? You can unmute yourself if you would like. or put something in the chat box? Nope, not looking like it. Okay. Yeah, Bernie, and talk kind of loud, because apparently the owl's not picking up some of the people at the back of the room.
Okay, you mentioned it's rare for bull trout to run to the sea. Do we know what factors would determine if an individual bull trout does run to the sea? And do we know if that's happened in the local population?
Technically not, but I would say it's highly unlikely, and I think that probably their component of anatomy or that life history form would most likely occur in populations that are closer to the coast. So yeah, as far as what triggers that, I'm not sure, but I would say that it's like, you know, obviously never say never, but it's highly unlikely that there's any sea run component to the bull trout that are within the Hood River Watershed. But yeah, like I said, that's certainly the most poorly documented life history form of bull trout, but it has been like I guess observed in like around the Puget Sound and whatnot. So even in Oregon, I'm not really sure of any known anadromous bull trout populations.
Any evidence on main stem spawning by adult bull trout? Way too warm, or, and it might not be successful spawning, but
Not that I know of. There are, Jason mentioned, there are spawning ground surveys that occur below Clear Branch within the upper Middle Fork Basin on, you know, periodically on Compass Creek, Elliott Creek, but I'm not sure. I know that the Forest Service saw a couple adult fish on Compass Creek several years ago, but in a red, but there hasn't been any documented main stem spawning that I'm aware of.
in the 1970s, when the winter steelhead, summer steelhead run was huge in the Hood River, we fished it a lot in the main stem, and I actually caught a spawning pair in the upper main stem of the Hood River, probably, well, it's below the farmer's diversion there. But anyway, it was a male and a female, and they were like 24, 25 inches long.
Yeah, it's
That was a long time ago.
We did radio text and bull trout
They were Dolly Varden back then.
oh yeah.
in the 90s, and they never stopped.
Mhm.
Tagged fish just pulled it. One of them straight into the Tunnel Creek version. They seem to have a habit of fishing.
Everybody called them Dolly Varden.
I mean, people still do, honestly, but they are two different species.
All right, maybe two last questions, Bernard, and then if there's anybody else, go ahead.
Since you're concerned about the low population numbers, what interventions, if any, might be considered in the future? For example, with removal of the dam at Laurance Lake, would that be beneficial to the population?
I mean, passage is certainly beneficial. So whether that looks like dam removal or fish passage facilities, more usable fish passage, and not to get into the weeds, but there was some limited trap and haul that occurred at Clear Branch Dam in the late 2000s. But yeah, I think certainly passage is a priority. The reason is that it would allow those fish above Clear Branch to move down lower into the system, which genetically would benefit both the population above Clear Branch and below, but also it reduces the risk that those fish have above Clear Branch, which is that their isolation puts them at risk for any sort of environmental event that might occur, whether it be a fire or some, you know, unpredicted thing that really significantly alters the habitat and potentially is detrimental to their population.
Any one last question? No, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.